The first home on this roll of film was built by Herbert and Genevieve Robinson Stanley. It was around the late 40s, and they lived there until '05. Palmyra was incorporated in 1807, located off of I-95, almost halfway between Waterville and Bangor, surrounding Newport, Detroit, Pittsfield, Hartland, and St. Albans, with community ties to all these towns. This beautiful farm was built around 1852, and sometime between then and 1939, Horace McShane raised potatoes and had a small dairy. In 1939, Albert and Kay Fields bought this farm. Albert was the best mechanic in town, working out of this small garage next to the road for over 20 years. He made a living working on farm equipment, cars, town trucks, and anything mechanical. If Albert couldn't fix it, you threw it away. In 1969, Robert and Marilyn Tardy bought this farm from Albert. The Tardys, a very caring and thoughtful couple, have always been involved in local and state politics. In 1972, Bob was elected and served on the Select Board. In 1984, he was elected state representative until 1995. In 2004, Bob became a lobbyist and still working in Augusta. Marilyn was a homemaker, raising 3 boys and a girl. Then in 1975, worked on the Palmyra School Board for 17 years until 1992. In 2007, Marilyn was appointed to the State Board of Education by Governor John Baldacci and is still serving today. Son Joshua was elected state representative in 2002 until present. We have no record of what happened to this small house, but in the 30s, the Boston family lived here until the late 60s, and also Shorty Davis after the Bostons. Gordon Costley was here until the late 70s. In 1958, Carl Emery donated this property to the town, and rumor has it that Carl gave the property for the purpose of a school to learn, and a stipulation no dancing on the premises. The famous U.S. Route 2, beginning in Rouse's Point, New York, and ends in Holton, Maine, with over 500 miles of the prettiest country in America. I highly recommend this road if you want to see the heartland of Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont, with many quaint villages and restaurants that feature home cooking and good old Yankee hospitality. Some sections are still being worked on, but overall a pretty smooth road. Try it out this summer, and when you reach Waterbury, Vermont, don't forget to stop in my shop, Waterbury Odds and Ends, just a half a mile off Route 2 on Route 100, just before Ben & Jerry's Ice Cream. Max Weeks built this house in the early 30s and married a Boston girl. Max was a designer for all types of machinery and worked for the Banton brothers for over 50 years and stayed on this property until he died in the 90s. We have no information on when this nice-looking home was built. In the early 20s, Frank and Sadie Bradford bought this property, and Frank farmed it in the early years. It was passed down to their daughter, Sally and Jerry Withy, in the late 60s, and they are still living there today. This farm was built in the early 1900s by Luke Frost. Luke ran the Palmyra General Store for many years, and in the mid-80s, Eunice and Louis Harper lived here. We now have turned onto the South Ridge Road. First farm up on the right was occupied by William Graham in the 20s. Prior to that, we have no information. Then in the early 30s, Hollis Weeks bought this farm. Hollis owned and operated the grist mill in the town next to Palmyra Store. He made cedar shingles and sold them throughout the county. In the 60s, Lester and Dorothy Robinson lived here. This farm is on the end of South Ridge Road. Back in the late 20s, Phil and Laura Bradford had a small dairy operation. And through the years, the Lawlers and then the Landrys owned the property. We have no information of its origin. In the early 1900s, Charlie Homestead had a dairy farm and raised potatoes. In the late 40s, Miles and Fern Grays also had a dairy operation. This nice little farm is all gone, but with this photo it may bring back some memories. In the early 20s, Charles and Arlene Kirsted lived here until the late 90s. Charles was a mill worker for many years in the Newport area. Alan Brewer had this farm in the early 30s. In the mid-40s, Raymond Spooner lived here through the late 80s. Then, Raymond sold it to his son-in-law, Donald Hill. Donald owns the ADA Fence Company and still resides here. We have no prior information on this farm. Andre Toll built this house and barn in the late 40s and ran a small dairy. In 1952, Ed and Florence Boulier took it over and continued farming until the late 70s. This was passed down to their son, Clarence, and wife, Cindy. Clarence is in the horse trading business and owns over 20 head. In 1921, Henry and Effie bought this large farm and ran a small dairy. Between him and his wife, they raised 13 children and sold bottled milk on the premises, and peddled their milk to stores and house to house in the 30s. In 1949, Dennis and Camille DeRocha bought the farm, and in the mid-50s they converted the barn to raise chickens. In the early 1900s, Littlefield Homestead ran a dairy operation until 1939. In 1940, Gilbert and Vivian Dyer ran the farm until the late 90s. They passed it down to their daughter, Mary and Robert Gagnon, and still reside there. This small house is all gone, and we have no information on it. If this kicks in a memory, give us a call. The next one up would be Charles Adams. He built this house in the mid-20s, and in the mid-40s, Lawrence and Beatrice Leonard was here until the early 90s. And then, sometime in the 50s or the 60s, this farm was occupied by Clarence and Phyllis Fletcher. Any information out there will be helpful. In 1911, a hurricane took down a barn very similar to the one you see here. And in the same year, with the help of all his neighbors, Frank Brewer built this beautiful, majestic barn with his brothers Albert and Bert. All three farmed this for many years. Then, sometime in the 50s, Preston and Mary Sargent farmed until 1970. In the mid-1800s, John Quincy Adams, not the president but maybe a relative, built this beautiful farm on the corner of Gray Road and U.S. Route 2. And in the late 1800s, John passed it down to his son, Homer Adams. He milked over 20 cows by hand for many years. Some years later, the farm burnt down, and an ice cream parlor was built in its place. But due to septic problems, it never opened. In 2005, David and Debbie Dyer opened up the St. Albans Stove Shop and is still in operation today. Sometime in the 20s, Ernest Parkman farmed this beauty on the end of Gray Road until the early 50s, and then Norris Friend bought the farm, and he put on some horse shows. Norris also owned the largest Ford dealership in Maine starting in 1923. In the mid-60s, Lewis and Sally Moran farmed it until the late 90s. And in 1998, Beulah Wyman and daughter Sherry opened up the Pine Grove Kennels and are still operating today. Very little information on this farm that is all gone today. In 1911, Frank and Harry Brewer, both brothers, bought this farm. In 1972, Preston Sargent lived here. In the late 1800s, Augustus and Ida purchased this great-looking farm. And then sometime later, Augustus died and Ida remarried Frank E. In 1935, Frank sold it to Fred and Christine McKenzie. They farmed until 1943. They sold it to Donald Wood, and he milked Jersey cows until 1998. Then, Donald passed it down to son Joe and Kay Wood, and they still reside there. We now turn right on Badgerboro Road. In 1871, at the young age of 23, Charles A. Levitt bought this farm. He farmed this until 1931, then turned it over to his sons Walter and Ernest, and they farmed till 1937. The brothers sold the farm to Olin Heath, and he farmed it until 1951. Then Charles and Jane Randall, grandson to Charles Levitt, bought the farm back into the family. They farmed for nearly 50 years until he turned it over to his son, William Randall, in '07. Between Charles Levitt and grandson Charles Randall, they farmed it for over 100 years on the same property. In 1912, Walter and Catherine Levitt resided here until 1948. They passed it down to Bill and Florence Randall in 1949. In 1959, son Jack and Doris Randall resided here. Both barn and house are dilapidated today. This is an original homestead built by Rummery Hanson in 1870. With over 60 acres of land, Rummery farmed for many years, and then he passed it down to his son, Lou and Minnie Hanson. In 1946, John and Ivy Chisholm farmed until 1953. Then John and Doris Burton resided here until 1987. Frederick and Priscilla McWilliams occupied the farm until 2004. In '04, Dennis and Tara Groves started a local produce and are still operating today. A gentleman by the name of Parkman built this farm and raised potatoes. And then sometime in the 20s, Alan Brewer took it over, and he also raised potatoes until the late 40s. In the early 50s, Wallace Gowdy built this chicken coop. He raised chickens until the early 90s. And then Alan Curl purchased this property in the late 90s and is still residing there today. We have now come to the end of the first roll of film highlighting Palmyra in the 60s. The staff of NEV Productions hope you enjoyed this first one-of-a-kind history in making production.